Coming up on this week's RegCast.
No gaps, no overlaps, so each individual is clearly accountable for something, and the story kind of begins and ends with a defined senior manager function. That, of course, cuts across the whole history of board collective engagement. What we really need, though, is a conversation right down from not just top to bottom, but also bottom back up to top.
You've got to start with ingestion of rules in the first place. So what aspects of the regimes are relevant to any particular activity? Then you've got to interpret those into policies and controls, and the controls have got to be embedded somewhere in the system. You've got to then report those back to the regulator, and meanwhile, human beings have got to use all this stuff.
If I can't demonstrate to the regulator, it's effectively a reversal of the burden of proof. If I can't demonstrate that I'm up to scratch, I won't get through this process. How comfortable are you that what you think is true or what's written down in the documentation of the firm actually happens in practice?
Don't go it alone. Stress the collaboration, and there are so many ways you can go about this. You need to kind of find some frameworks to be able to manage to, and that includes how you're thinking about deploying technology.
Welcome to RegCast.
RegCast. Shining a light on challenges and opportunities for digital compliance.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I am PJ DiGiamarino, CEO and founder of JWG, and I'm incredibly proud to be able to present another edition of RegCast. Today, we're focused on accountability, and the accountability cry has been ongoing for a number of years, and it has been a number of different jurisdictions playing in with their version of it. But effectively, the US started in 2015. The UK came in 2016, 2017 onward, we saw a number of new regimes that all asked for more responsibility to be given directly to people within the firms, and those firms then to hold those people accountable for their actions. And obviously, post-crisis, this has been a very popular agenda, but it's a very tricky one from a RegTech point of view. And this summer, we saw a big movement in Europe for the first time with one European member state, namely Ireland. So we wanted to put together this discussion to talk about what it will mean for first European country to start moving towards a really serious accountability regime. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details of what exactly the law says, but effectively it requires managers to be named, given responsibilities, and reported to their regulators. How you go about tracking that is a totally different kettle of fish. So I'm really pleased to have some experts here with me. I'm going to ask them quickly to introduce themselves, and then we'll get into three basic questions. Dr. Roger, can you please start?
Sure, PJ, thank you. Thanks for inviting me along. So, Roger Miles, I run the Conduct Academy for the UK Finance Association, previously the Banks Association in London. I trained as an auditor, practiced investor relations, and then did political engagement with the banking industry in London and Brussels for a decade or so. Retrained as a psychologist, looking at the mental structures that we use for regulatory design, and had the good fortune to hand in my thesis on this, saying we need more behavioural investigation on the eve of the financial crisis in 2008. Since when, I've been kept extremely busy on advisory panels to various regulators and, of course, a lot of financial firms, but we can get into that later.
Yeah, and thank you for coming back. We had you right around the time your book came out. Well, remind me what the book was about?
Yeah, it's actually, so the second in a series of three, and the latest one is Culture Audit in Financial Services. So looking at the new tools that conduct regulators are using in jurisdictions really all around the world, North America, Australia, the UK, Ireland, as we're going to talk about today, assessing how the cultural fabric of firms feeds across into one extreme, events of misconduct, and the other, what they're now calling exemplary customer service or exemplary conduct, which is one of the purposes of this whole senior managers regime that we're going to talk about today.
Fantastic. I'll reshare that link in the notes for the call today. So I think it's important for everybody to dial into that. Karen,
can I say the regulators have given it glowing reports, this piece of work, almost as if they're reading my research in order to develop their own ideas, which is really quite encouraging.
Good. Well, people can get it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. Karen, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks very much, PJ, for the invite to this this great event. So, Kieran Walker, I'm a consultant in Evershed Sutherland, based in Dublin. So I've been with Evershed Sutherland for the last 6 years. Prior to that, I was Deputy Head of Enforcement in the Central Bank. And I've been fascinated by the area of accountability and changing behaviors for, well over the 30 years or so of my career, looking at regulation and conduct in various industries, not just financial services, and understanding the dynamics of what and levers as to how individual and group behaviors can change. And just recently wrote a book on new accountability in financial services, changing individual behavior and culture. So looking at this interplay of regulation, sociology, psychology, and it's an absolutely fascinating area, and just interesting to see how the various regimes in Australia, UK, and now coming into Ireland, whilst formally speaking, they may look very similar. And a separate question is, well, how do they actually apply in practice, and what are the culture and other factors that influence how their impact in practice?
Absolutely. Thank you. And last but not least, Alan.
Thanks, PJ. Hi, everyone. I haven't written a book, sadly, but I did edit quite a few when I was in legal publishing. And then after that, I moved to the Financial Conduct Authority, publishing the handbook there. So I wrote a bit of that, I suppose. And during that time, we were looking at publishing rules as code and making the rules easy to understand and implement. And then in 2019, I joined APAX, a Swiss RegTech, to do that for real. And it's good to be back. And I just want to sort of hark back to the last conversation we had with Roger, that I'd recommend your new listeners to dig that one out, because that was an extremely enjoyable sort of preliminary conversation to this one, I think.
A great point. I'll make sure I put the link to that one in as well. Where we wanted to kick this one off was really about the drivers around what led to SEAR, and how it's planning to implement how it's going to achieve the aims that it sets out. Roger, you've spoken long and hard about how well these regimes are tuned for the actual needs of the industry. What do you think of how this comes after the conduct and culture agenda?
Sure. Well, I mean, I have to defer on this call to Kira, who's extremely fine piece of work comparing conduct regulators. I'm sure we'll come on to, but just to give you let's give you the 20 years of research compressed into 30 seconds version. What we realized when the financial crisis struck, or some of us had thought about it before, but realized, is that we've been focusing on contract regulation. So looking at legal certainties, econometric pricing arrangements, risk quantification, all that stuff, and not enough time looking at conduct. So we'd focused on contract at the expense of conduct, or in simple terms, how people behave, or the phrase I use all the time is what actually happens. There is a massive gap in every regulated firm between the official version of what we're doing and the on-the-ground version of what actually happens from day to day. And in fairness, conduct regulation is a brave attempt by regulators, led, by the way, by the Dutch, who we may talk a bit about later, and cheered on by the FCA in the UK and the Irish regulator, again, we'll talk about, but also being pioneered in places like Australia, North America, to get exemplary conduct as the normal focus for discussion. So not so much those long tail events of misconduct, egregious and expensive though those are, but to try and get into the normal fabric of conversation, the culture of the firm, if you like, an idea that we're all here to do something useful. And on top of that, to hold senior individuals personally accountable for their actions. Now that is grounded in deep behavioural science that says if you've got a big abstract risk, such as the conduct of an entire sector, it's far more comprehensible to the public if you can put a face on the risk. Now, you might say, as a fair criticism of that, it's a little bit like witch hunting, putting heads on spikes, trying to sort of call out senior individuals and sort of put them on the spot for the consequences of their decisions. Well, in a way that is true, but that's the negative aspect of what is intended as a positive initiative, which is to get senior people to step up and say, yes, I understand that I'm responsible for the culture of risk-taking and trading in my organization, and I'm happy to answer questions for that. Not that I'm the proxy for every single thing that ever happens. Clearly, we want the bottom-up conversation as well as top-down. But a key part of this is to hold those named individuals responsible, which is why in the UK we have SEAR attestation, so senior managers regime letter writing to the regulator saying, I understand my responsibilities. And of course, in the case of Ireland, SEAR, something very similar, which I know Kieran will be talking about.
Let's dive into that then, Karen. What are the key precepts of the Irish regime?
Yeah, well, actually, can I just add to what Roger's saying first before I come on to that, just very briefly, because it is worth mentioning just one of the key drivers, practical drivers for this in Ireland. There was a particular issue in relation to tracker mortgages, a scandal. I don't need to go into the detail of all of that. Basically, people were overcharged significantly for their mortgages, and some people lost their homes as a result of it. And the Minister for Finance said, this is disgraceful behavior by the banks. We need to address this. And what he did was he got the central bank to do a report on the culture of the 5 retail banks in Ireland. And this feeds into Roger's comment, which I think is very important about what actually happens. What the central bank did was they got a team over from the Dutch regulator and said, well, we don't really understand how this works. You're the experts, the Dutch regulator, help us out here. So they trained up basically the central bank, and in 2018 the central bank produced a report, a first report on the culture of the retail banks, aimed at addressing, well, what actually happens here? What are the dynamics of how these firms actually operate? And as part of that, the central bank set out in some detail on its recommendation for an individual accountability regime. So that was the if you like, the immediate driver for the recommendation leading to where we are now and the bill. But it suggests very clearly there is a very strong political impetus to address this, to address the drivers of poor behavior. And so then if I move on to, well, so what are the key factors in this new regime? Well, basically we have at the moment, we have a bill that was published in July. We don't know when the bill is going to be enacted. My guess would be towards the end of this year, maybe early next year. Now, it's a framework bill. So an awful lot of the meat will be in implementing guidelines and implementing regulations that the central bank has said it will publish for public consultation in draft form immediately after the bill is enacted. So we're looking probably early next year when we see the detail of all of that. But essentially, it's not going to look too much different to the SMCR. So people who are familiar with the UK senior manager regime won't be hugely surprised. There are a few points of detail we can come on to discuss, but the broad thrust of it will be very familiar to people who are familiar with the SMCR. Just another point, interesting, if when we get on to discussing the behavioral aspects of all of this, and is it actually likely to work? My own thought on this at a very high level is there are very broadly 3 levers to changing behaviors, I think. And I suppose my own way of looking at this in very, very high level terms. One might be around the stick, sort of going after individuals. And there's a very strong sense among some people, well, that's great. We'll have heads and spikes, as Roger says. Let's do that. But actually, a lot of the thinking on that is, well, of course, regulators need to have these powers, need to exercise them in appropriate circumstances. But does it actually change behaviors? Does it actually provide a sufficient deterrent? Not so sure about that, and we can debate that. So that's, if you like, at the first level going in as a lever to change behaviors. A second lever, which I think is the more practical lever, which would be a big part of SEAR in Ireland, is really around governance, changing governance structures, approaches to governance, and the day-to-day practicalities of how firms operate, getting that clarity around who's responsible for what. And the experience we have in the UK and other jurisdictions is that surprisingly, when this regime was implemented, if companies find they thought they knew who was responsible for what, they thought how the place operated, but this served as a wake-up call for them to realize actually they weren't as certain about this as they thought they were. So there are potential benefits to improving governance. However, obviously there's a risk that it may turn into, to an important extent, a kind of a box-ticking exercise by some firms, and we can discuss that. The survey evidence that we have so far done from the UK and Australia indicates that there are some benefits to that. In particular, that it focuses minds. And interestingly, an Australian survey talked about the empowering effect of accountability. So people who might have had less power within organizations, the compliance functions, they become a little bit more empowered. People are a little bit more, if you like, forced to listen to them because of this new regime. And that does change the dynamic of what happens within firms. The third lever, I think, of interest, very high level lever of behavioral change, is much more around, it's around industry engagement to positively influence peer behaviors. As the Dutch regulators talked about, it's peer behavior that influences other behavior of others. You look around and see, well, what's acceptable around here? What's not acceptable around here, regardless of what the law and regulations say, and regardless of what's written in firm documentation or those wonderful value statements on the walls. People look around and say, well, what actually works around here? What can it not, perhaps to some extent, what can I get away with? Or what can I not get away with? And I think that's a very interesting potential direction of travel, really, because we have the behavioral standards, the conduct standards. They're very high level. And Finance UK produced a report when it looked at the implementation of SMCR in the UK and said, well, actually, maybe the industry could play a role in developing industry standards. And it's really, I think, around normalizing good behaviors. That requires a lot more detail than thou shalt be ethical. One needs to look at a bit more detail of what does that actually mean in particular circumstances, because we all believe we act ethically. But when confronted with particular situations and when told, well, actually, in this particular situation, this is what's considered to be good behavior or appropriate behavior, these things do need to be teased out. So I see that as if you like, a lever of potential behavioral change that I think needs to be teased out more in a regime. It can't simply be left to the regulator to sort everything out.
Well, I can't disagree. As I run a joint working group platform, so that's it. But for years we've had a great conversation around this. A lot of it gets stuck though in the technology conversations. I like to go to Alan. I mean, the tensile strength of the stick is directly dependent upon how much good oversight and visibility you have. What have you found to be some of the challenges in the RegTech space around this problem?
Yeah, so I think I don't think the technology is too difficult in terms of putting it in place, because the broader technologies are there to support that. So you have most banks running on a core banking platform, some sort of system of governance, and within those existing technologies, you can plug in technologies or applications that are particularly focused on supporting good behavior, good choices, or putting in the guardrails, making sure that always the best outcome is achieved. I think the challenge comes in the options and the plethora of technologies that are available for you to do that. And it's being able to also trust the technology that you as a bank are presented with, because this particularly apposite to senior manager regime, someone's neck is on the line. And if the technology lets them down, that's not necessarily their fault. It's not something they've deliberately set about to do. And yet their head is on the block for that. They're going on the stick, the spike. Their head is on the spike. So the challenges are, can we identify the correct technology to do this? Can we trust that technology to do it in a way that means that I'm happy taking on that risk? And here, I think there's a gap. The sort of last leg of this is the gap between the banks and the technology vendors and the regulators. And it would be super helpful if the regulators said, you know what, if you've got this technology stack in place, we're okay with that. And from an SMCR or CEAR point of view, you're doing everything that we're expecting you to do.
Yeah, and we've seen many speeches over the years talking about how the surveillance and monitoring of the employees is fundamental, but we never quite get beyond that to the conversation about, well, what kind of tools actually are needed. Let's come back to Roger on this one, because I know you, in your book, you sort of kick this conversation around.
I'm more agnostic than perhaps the book says, and one of my co-authors in the book, Rachel Walcott of Thomson Reuters, who I'm sure many of you will read regularly, is more of a technology skeptic, perhaps, than I am. What I would say is I see in my work a large number of technologists kind of pitching ideas, and an awful lot of it looks like old-fashioned trade surveillance just in new bottles. And my concern is I think Kieran made a very sound point about the regulatory thinking here, and why do we have senior managers? Why do we have these sort of faces in the frame? There is clear psychological theory that shows that when people face what's called vivid and salient punishment, in other words, something that's going to personally hurt you if you misbehave, they tend to focus more on the problem. So there is some positive outcome from the whole legal theory of deterrence, that provided you're focusing on an appropriate deterrent, you will get behavior change. However, in financial markets, that tends to translate into probability of detection and significance of the cost of the fine, which I have to say, even under SMCR, after what we have 6-7 years in the UK of this, are still seen as relatively slight, not helped by the fact that we've had a number of high-profile cases where very senior people have been in the frame potentially for senior manager, inappropriate conduct events, and the actual level of punishment is perceived by the industry to be quite slight. And there is a chapter in our book where we look at the history of SMCR, as it were, the traction of this structure over behavior. And I'm sorry to say our conclusion is that it hasn't really gained the traction that we might have wished that it would. Now, part of that, I am very much supportive of Kieran's view. And by the way, there's a common thread through all of this, that the Dutch central bank team, and it's bizarre that the Netherlands is not a major financial market, and yet they have this really outsized influence. It's because their political thinking is way, way ahead of ours. They are probably 30 years ahead in terms of the application of behavioral science to regulatory design. They were doing stuff back in the early 90s, which set the path for a lot of what the rest of the world has since done. What they have, for example, suggested through that master document, which the DNB published in 2016, is this idea of no gaps, no overlaps. So each individual is clearly accountable for something, and the story kind of begins and ends with a defined senior manager function. That, of course, cuts across the whole history of board collective engagement, the idea that the board is collectively like a hive mind, addressing problems, sharing experience, drawing on deep resources, and that there is, for good reasons, a diffusion of responsibility. Now, you can't have diffusion of responsibility coexisting with a specified senior manager narrowly defines SMF role responsibility. So there's a kind of tension in the design there, which doesn't play out very well. And the more you try and systematize this through surveillance, through RegTech, the more it's kind of pushing against the natural tendency of the board to want to think, apply its collective mindedness. By the way, just on one narrow point, I've been running a research strand with NED, so senior non-execs, on bank boards now for getting on 10 years, actually longer than SMCR itself has been around. There's very positive primary evidence that NEDs are seeing their roles as greatly increasing in traction since SMCR. So they're asking better questions, they're challenging overmighty assumptions by executives. We're seeing much more attention given to turnover in roles, so people are not kind of staying around in role and outliving their usefulness. And I think I see all of these as useful byproducts of the SMCR way of thinking, even if we've not seen any especially encouraging prosecutions under SMCR itself. So I mean, the two prosecutions that Rachel calls out in the book, for example, are for accessing pornography at work and fare dodging, in the train on the way to work. Neither of which is really what you might call financial misconduct, although it does fall into this space that we're now increasingly looking at of non-financial misconduct, or as one of my American clients said, oh, you mean behaving like a jerk, which is a very good definition for that. If you're an obnoxious person to work with, there's quite a lot of psychological evidence that says, if you're a kind of casual rule cutter who's casually unpleasant to people in whatever an ist kind of way at work, that actually is quite a good red flag for you're also going to have a casual attitude to rules generally. And therefore that's, incipient financial misconduct. So I'm quite a fan of that school of thinking, although worst case, it does look a little bit like kind of Tom Cruise, pre-crime detection. And I'm aware of several technology stacks which address that kind of thing. And what are these pre-incident indicators that we can look at in, code switching, language, call switching between different channels onto WhatsApp rather than your squawk box, these kind of specific indicators, which have been much talked about since the US prosecutors started to weigh in behind them. One final one, just for fun, Glassdoor, the employee critique channel of your employer. So a couple of regulators are seriously starting to look at Glassdoor as a kind of triangulation indicator of incipient misconduct in employer firms, which I think is deeply interesting. But maybe that's a bit of a sideshow for today's conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it always amazes me. We can't have one of these conversations without talking about Minority Report, which came out multiple
Yes.
decades ago. And the reality is that those technology stacks exist now. You know,
They do.
Not with the people that can see into the future because of some abnormality in their biological makeup, but you know, there are plenty of technologies that really help sift through all this data and compare it to the policies that are digitized and tied back to the rules.
Well, PJ, may I just pick out two developments in the tech, because it may be that Alan or you know, others want to come back on this. I think we now have this thing called 100% audit. So when I trained as an auditor, you know, 30 years ago, it was all based on sampling theory. You had to get a random number generator and pull out sort of files that the generator told you to look at, which of course has the massive practical flaw that you're not likely to pick up really when the bad stuff is happening, just because law of numbers, you know, people are going to get away with stuff. Now you have the data processing capacity to literally audit everything through a massive data funnel. Allied to that, you have at least dawning the AI, which is able to spot intuitively, also, you know, quasi-intuitively, patterns of misconduct. So there was a language analytical firm who pitched to me recently, who show you can put the entire voice tapes of a trading organization, so, you know, 50,000 trading desks, all the voice tapes for 2 years, which is just a staggering quantity of unstructured data. And this analytic can pick out events sort of separated by 6 months and possibly by you know, tens of thousands of miles of geographical distance, and they can show incipient misconduct just through code switching, channel switching, something slightly off from the corridor of normal acceptable behavior. And to me, that's deeply fascinating. As a language analyst myself in my previous life, that's really interesting, being able to pick up on those fine early signals.
It is interesting, but yet there's no guidance from regulators on whether that's actually technology they expect to be deployed.
Sure. Worst case, you get technologies that are developed by people who don't entirely understand the data that they're handling and are grafting on. You're actually creating misconduct risks amongst the technologists. And there've been, and I know Kieran might pick up on this, a couple of prosecutions in Australia for inappropriately designed customer service bots, which are kind of nudging people towards inappropriate product purchase decisions based on the prejudices, the biases, let's call them, of the bot designers.
Yeah, I mean, that's the dark side of the dark side of this technology, right?
Right. All you're doing is amplifying pre-existing stereotypes and biases, which is not really what we want.
No. And it also has a direct knock on to your employees, whether they, once they know everything is being surveilled, are they likely to want to...
Oh, totally. Well, so what we call the good heart effect, you know, the moment people know what the indicators are, they place the indicators.
Yeah.
So they will narrowly conform to the indicators and basically ignore all the other good behavioral stuff they should be doing.
So Karen, I mean, this is a big deal for Ireland, right? Because you're facing this market that's had a number of expectations set about what this actually really means in practice. But obviously, Ireland will have its own perspective. From your point of view, what are some of the key points that firms ought to be looking at to get right in, you know, for SEAR now?
Yeah, well, actually, just one trend I just want to pick on first, in relation to Roger's point about the salience of this, and you know, there haven't been too many findings against individuals in the UK. What's interesting to me in an Irish context, particularly, is the central bank. One of the key tools it tends to use is when individuals apply for senior role under the current system is a pre-approval process. And I've been involved in quite a number of cases assisting individuals to get through that process. And if they're more senior individuals, that's probably going to involve an interview with the central bank. That's when these things become salient. The salience isn't, in an Irish context particularly, isn't just well, you know, my chances of being caught after the event and being either prosecuted or fined or whatever, you know, I'll take the risk. People, particularly non-execs, as Roger mentioned, you know, they have to go through this process, and it might be every year, 2-3 years. So their chances of an interview at the central bank are pretty high. That provides a reasonably regular opportunity for the central bank to ask questions around issues. They will have the conduct standards, and they will say, right, so in particular circumstance X, what did you do that you shouldn't have done, or did you speak up, and all the rest of it. So that's where salience becomes important. That's where individuals will say, actually, I now have to demonstrate to the regulator that I complied with these standards, because if I can't demonstrate to the regulator, it's effectively a reversal of the burden of proof. If I can't demonstrate that I'm up to scratch, I won't get through this process. So that's where SEAR really kicks in, I think, on a practical level for senior people, where they'll say, okay, my people will organize the process around all of this. We'll put all the documentation in place, blah, blah, blah. But this is when it gets serious for individuals, when they go applying for a senior role, and they have to be able to demonstrate this to the regulator. In terms of what should firms be doing now or in the near future, well, the meat of this really will be in implementing regulations and guidelines from central bank, which may issue for consultation in draft form early next year. But really what firms need to do now is boards need to be fully briefed so that they understand what this actually involves. In terms of what's expected, the risk for some firms is they might treat it as some form of compliance project and hand it over to the compliance people and say, there you go, put all the process and procedures in place. The chances are the outcome won't be particularly good in such circumstances. The board really needs to understand what this is actually all about. And it's very much about the regulators looking at changing behaviors and cultures within organizations and figuring out how that can be best done. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, as we know from UK experience, the implementation process in terms of communications, doing the checks in relation to annual reviews for fitness and probity purpose and all the rest. There's a huge amount of work that needs to go into all of that. Firms will need to be ready for. We have the experience already in the UK. We've gone through that. We've seen a lot of the pitfalls. Firms have to appreciate this is a big enough deal that will take a bit of time to put in place. So we spend quite a bit of time with firms now. They appreciate we don't have the detail just yet, but they need to be lining up their budgets, their people, their processes, their project teams. But the core point they need to understand is this is not just another compliance project. This goes deeper than that if they want it to be successful and they don't want to have problems with the regulator in due course.
Just on that point, Karen, would you have any expectations about timing that they'll have to get ready?
I can only guess, Shay. My guess at the moment is that there'll be, let's say the bill gets enacted, say end of this year, early next year, then the central bank produces its draft implementing regulations, etc., for public consultation. There'll be a number of months for that. Let's say they get finalized around the summer of next year. There will then have to be lead-in time to allow firms to prepare for the implementation of this. So for the moment, my guess is that day one of the new regime might be the back end of next year, actually possibly, sometime early the following year, so early 2024, something like that. But that's obviously purely a guess at the moment.
But in that scenario, you would need to have a team up and running next year to get ready to be able to implement by the time it goes live.
Yeah, just because the process around all of this takes quite a bit of time, and it's, this will have an impact for individuals. Individuals say, well, I thought I was responsible for issues A, B, and C. Now you're telling me that I have to fill out a statement of responsibility. So now you're saying I'm also responsible for X and Y, and I didn't know about this. Or, I'm now responsible in a way that I didn't think I was for, let's say, the IT system or whatever. I don't think I'm fully up to speed in all of this. I need to get trained up on this. I need to get ready for this. I don't want to be caught out. Or I have a team of 100 people. I have a faint idea what a lot of them are doing, but not sure I know what all of them are doing. And I'm not expert enough to be able to question what they're doing. They don't have to be an expert in everything all 100 people or 1,000 people are doing, but they have to be able to satisfy themselves that they're in control. And if they don't know what these people are doing, or don't have the sufficient expertise to ask intelligent questions in particular areas, they're probably going to have a problem. So there's a lot of preparation around all of that. And it does come down to individual contracts or individuals. We look at this on a firm level and say the firm is responsible for X and Y, but the firm has to manage this internally with people who will say, well, hang on a sec, this ultimately comes down to me. I'm on the hook for this. I, as an individual, need to be satisfied I can take on this responsibility.
Yeah, and it will have a global impact, right? So if the Dublin office is in charge of somebody in Paris, then there's an extension, therefore, into across the border.
Yeah, there can be. So they need to be very careful around all of that as well.
Yeah.
And that needs to be very carefully managed
No,
because of the implications.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of 6-minute increments will be expended on contracts and the like.
Yes. Well, nobody will want to damage their individual relationship with the central bank, because if they apply for another role anywhere else in the world, the other regulators will want to know about that.
Yeah, no. Alan, let's come to you. I mean, you've been involved in these conversations for a while. This looks like a great opportunity. What has to happen to get it right?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think, as I recall, we had about a 12-month implementation window in the UK, and that proved to be a very tight window. But I think the benefit of not going first, as Kieran says, is you've got plenty of lessons learned already out there, and you've got a lot of consultancy firms, law firms ready to go with this stuff, right? So they've already got, to a certain extent, a lot of this pre-packaged. So I think if you've got the right advisors in place, you can certainly cut out a lot of the pain that it takes to implement this stuff. But if your kind of existing technologies aren't quite up to snuff, then you've got a significant problem if you want to start upgrading bits and pieces ready for better sort of surveillance and that sort of thing. And that's going to take a lot longer than 12 months. So it really depends on how you feel as an organization, as an institution, how prepared you are. But I think time is of the essence, is really what it takes. And a good consultancy firm or advisory firm with a good track record of implementing this around the world is your bare minimum, I would suggest.
And that we say technology platform, but there's a lot of things that have to get put onto it. Can you just break down some of the key things?
Well, I think you've got to start with ingestion of rules in the first place. So what aspects of the regimes are relevant to any particular activity? Then you've got to interpret those into policies and controls, and the controls have got to be embedded somewhere in the system. You've got to then report those back to the regulator, and meanwhile, human beings have got to use all this stuff. So there's no one who does the whole thing, right, start to finish. So you're going to have a monitoring piece of kit, you're going to have a surveillance engine, you're going to have a rules engine, potentially managing the kind of interaction with the platform. I wish it was as simple as saying, just take this off the shelf and plug it in here, but unfortunately it's not. And these regimes change all the time, right? So the regime that you get in the UK might not be exactly the same as it is in, I don't know for sure, Kieran will know, but it might not be exactly the same as Ireland, certainly not the same as you get in APAC. So there's always going to be discrepancies. You can't lift and shift this stuff either. You've sort of got to bespoke it for your particular needs, which is why, as I say, time is of the essence.
Well, that's an excellent point to move to our wrap up, gentlemen. Thank you very much for helping to clarify what this might feel like. In summary, I wanted to get to your one piece of advice you would give to bankers that haven't faced this before. Roger, what would you leave them with?
Just this. A lot of people come into my sessions saying, so what does good conduct look like? Can you give me like 10 things to do? It looks fine. Actually, there's one thing to do which wraps around all of this, includes everything Alan has said and Kieran has said. Don't fixate on tone at the top, even though it's called senior managers regime. What they really, what does the conduct regulator really want? That's the other question I always get asked. What they really want to see is that there is intelligent engagement with good customer service throughout the organization. For sure, senior managers need to lead that and own the specific business and control aspects of that. What we really need, though, is a conversation right down from not just top to bottom, but also bottom back up to top. So anecdote gathering, regular conversations with frontline staff. Singapore, for example, the regulator goes straight to frontline staff and interviews them around their experience of talking to senior managers around what's good conduct. So that's one possible direction of travel for this train. So get everyone involved. Don't fixate, for all that we talked about technology and the legal detail. Really what the regulator wants to see overarching all this is intelligent engagement. Everyone working with you in your financial brand has given some thoughts to what is the best outcome for customers here? They're not just blindly selling stuff because the reward system drives them towards a certain pattern of behavior. So start that conversation now. By the way, most of my work with firms is that simple conversation starter piece, and and then we can pass on to the more details, legal systems design stuff and the technology follow through.
Yeah, no, that very wise advice, and I think there's also then the element of how do you get there, because you may have a vision of where you want to go, but everyone else is on the same page.
Time precludes. I have a bag of tools which kind of get that conversation started in a disciplined but also painless way. But I too short to talk about now.
Excellent, Karen. What's your perspective on the one thing to leave senior managers with?
Yeah, I'd say the one thing I would emphasize with senior managers is make it your business to ensure that you're properly informed about what's going on around the business. A core point behind the whole SMCR was the issue of willful blindness, where the most senior people ignored issues that were going around in their firm and said, not my concern. And when the risks blew up, they said, if only we had known. So that was the issue of willful blindness. I think it's a lot of the time these days, it's more around wishful thinking. So at the most senior level, the sense that, well, we look after the customer, we're great on X, Y, and Z, our people are fully engaged. Well, I'd say, well, how do you know that? How comfortable are you that what you think is true or what's written down in the documentation of the firm actually happens in practice? So it's critical that senior managers make it their business to ensure that they check this and not simply rely on being told information from some in nicely formatted documentation on board packs. It's critical for particularly board members to look behind the neatly packaged board packs to understand what's actually going on within their firm. And increasingly, I think regulators will say, well, sure, that may have said that in your board pack, but did you look behind that?
Yeah, that's a great one. Thank you. Alan, well, wrap this up for us.
So I think my piece of advice would be, don't try and work around the regime. When I was at the FCA and we implemented this, we saw some hilariously bad workarounds, organization charts with this mysterious layer of management that was going to take all of the accountability. Don't do that. You've got to work with the regulator and your internal risk team as well. You as an individual need to understand what it means to be an SMF or whatever the code is, wherever you are. And actually it's part of your credentials of being a participant in the financial services industry, right? You can take this tag that you have as a senior manager and use it to your advantage. So if you're a long-term participant in financial services, you're going to be talking to the regulator in many different roles. So for me, it's embrace it, be someone, a bearer of good conduct. I mean, that's the point of it, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think those are all excellent messages. I would just add, don't go it alone. Stress the collaboration, and there are so many ways you can go about this. You need to kind of find some frameworks to be able to manage to, and that includes how you're thinking about deploying technology. Not that we all need to deploy the same one, but we need some patterns. We need some perspectives on what kinds of technologies are good in this space. So thank you very much for continuing that dialogue. I look forward to catching up again with some of you over the course of our run up to the JWG annual conference, which is on the 9th and 10th of November. So really looking forward to producing a lot of good shows before then. If you do like what you've heard and you want other people to find it, please rate and review it. It helps us get out on whatever platform you picked us up on, and we'll be back with you soon. Thanks very much.
You can download the podcast via Spotify, Apple, and Google. But also, I'd encourage people to come to the JWG website, which, as hopefully you will know, is jwg-it.eu. Go to the Intelligence Hub and create your bespoke library. This is RegCast,
Shining a light on challenges and opportunities for digital compliance.